Hello, everyone. I am here with Robert Felix. For those who don't know, he is the author of IceAgeNow.info and the previous website, IceAgeNow.com. He is the author of Not by Fire, but by Ice, and of Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. We have at least mentioned both of those books, and we've talked about a couple of the points brought up and some of the scientific evidence in the world that has been supporting some of the things that Robert Felix wrote about, at this point, a couple of years ago to maybe more than a couple of years ago. He has done a lot of studying, much more time spent in school than most of us would love to, but he has a paragraph on his website that I think sums up a lot of who he is today, and you're all going to recognize this from one of the things that makes an individual a suspicious observer. Felix is not affiliated with any university, scientific establishment, or corporation, and therein lies his strength. Untainted by institutional bias or conventional wisdom, this architect turned author brings fresh insight into the study of ice ages. Robert, how are you doing today?
I am doing great, Ben. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Now you are in the Pacific time zone, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, excellent. We are recording this Friday afternoon, so it is just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in the New Valley of the Sun, Albuquerque. And so, Robert, it is just after lunch for you. Hopefully, we don't have a large impetus to want to take a nap after a large lunch now, and we can talk about some ice ages and magnetic reversals.
We absolutely can. I'll enjoy it.
Terrific, terrific. Now, um, you have been looking at this material, and it has been, if correct me if I'm wrong, a true passion of yours for a couple of decades now.
It sure has. Yeah, I began researching this in 1991, and I was not aiming for magnetic reversals. What I was doing is I was decided I was going to write a book on what really killed the dinosaurs, and for some reason at that time I thought it was an asteroid or meteor, and so I started researching and researching and researching, and the more I researched, the more I decided, no, I think it has to do with magnetic reversals. And to begin with, I didn't even know what they were, to be honest. For those who are listening who don't know, it's a time when compasses would be pointing, instead of toward the Arctic, would be pointing toward the Antarctic, and vice versa. But I decided that a magnetic reversal had an awful lot to do with the dinosaur extinction. And then the more I researched and the more I researched, I realized that magnetic reversals also, as far as I'm concerned, trigger ice ages, and that they return in a cycle, in a regular pattern that we should actually be able to predict.
Well, I want to talk about that cycle, and specifically, I hope it'll be okay if we ask about something that tends to be maybe a bit shorter of a cycle than is commonly thought of in the mainstream look at what you'd call paleogeomagnetism. But if we can talk about the connection between magnetic reversals and ice ages, it's one that we have not been happy to make, but that we have had no intellectual choice but to come to similar conclusions. Could I ask a little bit more about some of the connections that make you put magnetic reversal and ice age in the same sentence there?
Well, what I see is that ice ages have been returning in a fairly predictable cycle tied to precession of the equinoxes. And we descended into the Younger Dryas about 12,000 years ago, which was a period of of an ice age, or at least a smaller ice age, if you want to call something that sent 40% of the world's larger mammals into extinction, if you want to call that small. But anyway, that was about 12,000 years ago. About 23,000 years ago, we descended into a major ice age. By the way, the one 12,000 years ago correlates with what's known as the Gothenburg magnetic reversal or magnetic excursion. the ice age about 23,000 years ago correlates with the Mono Lake magnetic excursion. Then about 33,500 years, 34,000 years ago, we had an ice age that correlates with the Lake Mungo magnetic excursion. It seems to also correlate with when the Neanderthal went extinct. There's another one. There's so many of them, but a big one was the Blake magnetic reversal about 115,000 years ago, and that correlates with the end of what's known as the Eemian period. And the Eemian period was a time on Earth. It was interglacial. It lasted about 12,000 years, and then came the. And by the way, it was even warmer than it is today. For those who think that we humans are causing global warming, but that was even warmer then. And then we had the Blake magnetic reversal, and we descended into catastrophic glaciation in less than 100 years. Some people say in less than 20 years. So these things happen tremendously rapidly. But as I did the research, I just saw more and more of these ice ages that correlate with magnetic reversals. And I don't think it's an accident.
Yeah, we've come to that exact same conclusion. Now, what's interesting is the only thing that look through time wouldn't tell you, and that's how that works. Have you ever looked into any of the information about how a magnetic reversal might cause an ice age?
Well, my theory, and I think I'm getting closer and closer to proving that theory. But I think that I think our magnetic field, the magnetosphere, protects us from cosmic rays and from solar cosmic rays, galactic cosmic rays, and solar cosmic rays. But I think that as we lose our magnetic field strength, that's what happens when we go into a reversal. As we lose that strength, I think that we are seeing what we see is more and more volcanic activity, and more specifically underwater volcanic activity. When I started writing the book back in 1991, scientists thought there were 10,000 underwater volcanoes in the entire world, and now that was 1991. By 1993, scientists had discovered another 1,100 underwater volcanoes off the coast of Easter Island. So they increased the world supply of underwater volcanoes by 10% in just a matter of months. Well, now NASA estimates that there are probably more than 3 million underwater volcanoes. Well, what I see is that those underwater volcanoes, that volcanic activity increases tremendously at the beginning of ice ages when we have a reversal. So all of that lava pouring into the sea, that magma pouring into the sea, starts heating the seas, or at least heating the surface of the sea, and that increases evaporation. Well, then, so you've got this increased evaporation rising into the skies that have been cooled by the above water volcanoes, and that, to me, is the recipe for an ice age.
That is I would imagine that the folks listening to this are probably wondering if you and I huddled up on this before we had this call, because that's utterly close to what we've been saying now for a while. There was some excellent science that came out in 2011 that discussed how cosmic rays, the highest energy ones, the ones that would actually penetrate into the mantle, would actually surge upward the viscosity level of silica-rich magma. And what's interesting is it was a very convincing study, but it was the only one of its kind until about a month ago, when another completely independent international team of collaborators showed not only that there was the volcanic dust index of the atmosphere went up and down over approximately 11 years, indicating a lagged modulation by the sun. But they also said that the biggest spikes throughout history, so far as they could reconstruct, appeared to happen during the Dalton minimum period of the sun, during the Maunder minimum period of the sun, meaning that it was indeed at least a temporal, a time-related correlation between periods of high cosmic rays on Earth and periods of high volcanic activity. And we haven't even gotten into the idea that cosmic rays create clouds, and clouds on this planet are white, unlike Venus, and so they have a perfect albedo reflection profile. Uh, Greenhouse effect doesn't quite work as well here as it does on Venus, but maybe that's another conversation. Um, so, Robert, I'm thinking that it's pretty clear that a lot of your research is at least on a parallel highway to where all of our listeners have been. Now, I would love to talk a little bit more about this timeline because we've got a lot of signs that things are changing here again. And if I may just come out and ask you the question, do you believe that we are in the beginning process of another magnetic reversal or significant magnetic excursion on this planet right now?
I absolutely do. Well, for a couple of reasons. One is that I see this cycle that's tied to the precession cycle. So I think that we are absolutely. The last one was about 12,000 years ago. So I think the next one is now on the way. In 1997, when I first came out with Not by Fire but by Ice, I put in there that our magnetic field had declined by more than 50% in the last 2,000 years. But I put in there that the rate of decline had been increasing, and it was now remember this is 20 years ago, but that it was declining at the rate of 5% per century. Well, now, and I'm sure you've talked about this too, but the European Space Agency and their satellite probes called SWARM, they've now determined that our magnetic field strength is declining not 5% per century, but 5% per decade. So I see we're heading into to a reversal now. And also, it was a couple of years ago, I think, that the British Geological Survey came out with their own study, and they believe that we're headed for a magnetic reversal. So I think we're going into it right now. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you by chance catch the work out of Berkeley in 2014 that said that the full reversal can happen in less than a human lifetime? Something as little as
You
80
know,
years?
I did. I posted that on my website back when that came out. But there was an earlier one, and I'm trying to remember the names. I think one of these scientists was from Berkeley too, but it was a study by Coe, Prevost, and Mankinen. What they did is, and this was long before 2014, but they drilled cores into a lava flow at Steens Mountain in central Oregon, because that's how one of the ways they can tell what the magnetic field was doing at the time. When lava comes out of a volcano, it's so hot that it has no magnetic inclination. But as it cools down through the Curie temperature, it takes on the magnetic inclination of the day. Well, they drilled cores into the center of the lava flow, and then they drilled cores at the edges of the lava flow, and the magnetic field had reversed. And so they figured that magnetic field had reversed during the difference in time it took for the center of the lava flow to cool as it did for the edges of the lava flow. So they ended up, and everybody laughed at them, of course, but they ended up saying, it could have occurred in as little as 30 days.
Wow.
And I do have a link, not a link, but I do have, that's in the bibliography, and Not by Fire but by Ice. So, those guys, they were laughed at the time, but they may be right.
Yeah, that's not exactly the most settling of news, if I might say so.
Right.
Right.
There's another one. Well, you had mentioned that, but one of the I forget which magnetic reversal excursion it was, but they have found evidence of other reversals that may have occurred in less than 500 years. But a big part of big problem with finding this is you got to be you got to be drilling your cores, or you got to be drilling down into the earth. And boy, it is so easy to miss. If something was only 500 years long, or even if it was a human lifetime long, the odds of you actually looking at the particular part of that core at the right time are way against it. So I give scientists credit for finding any of these, actually.
Yeah, that is actually a very good point. You know what else is a good point? It is not difficult to get your Google on, do a little bit of research, and figure out that there's mass extinctions tied to these magnetic reversals. But I also think that when we're talking about this shorter timeline, that gives humans probably experiencing at least a couple of these since we started using tools. Definitely not any since we started using electricity, but this isn't like a we're all gone type of situation. There's the possibility uh, that we'll make it through this, or perhaps even make it through it a little differently than we started. Right? You've got this idea about evolutionary leaps coming from magnetic reversals, and Professor August Dunning from Caltech talked about that a little bit at our conference just under 1 month ago. And so we'd love to hear a little bit more on that topic. I know all the folks who attended were really interested in that concept.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It's the book that I wrote, Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. I guess I'm going head to head with Charles Darwin, but Darwin had said that evolution, occurs in a slow, stately manner over thousands of years, even millions of years. But paleontologists don't see it that way at all. Um, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, the former, deceased now, but he wrote a paper called "Punctuated Equilibria," where he saw that evolution takes giant leaps. I've got one chapter in the book, Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. One chapter starts with it's called "Suddenly," because every paleontologist that I know of is saying that evolution does indeed take giant leaps. And so going from there, the other thing I discovered that after each extinction, and I can correlate extinctions with magnetic reversals. Yeah, absolutely. I think that magnetic reversals lead to extinctions. But the other thing is that these evolutionary leaps take place right after magnetic reversals, and you'll have new species that never before appeared in the record, and with no more known forebears. They just suddenly show up, and there's just so many cases of that when it does speed up, and the big reason I think that this happens, and I'm sure you've said this too, but our magnetic field, as you have said, protects us from cosmic rays and from galactic cosmic rays and from solar cosmic rays. And those have radiation. And so in my studies, I found out that at the Gothenburg magnetic reversal, for instance, why there were great spikes in carbon-14, which is radioactive. There were spikes in beryllium-10. There were spikes in strontium. And so what I see is we have spikes in these radioactive materials that, in many cases are certainly going to cause cancer and lead to death. But in other cases, I'm saying that leads to entirely new species.
I think you're absolutely right there.
Yeah.
They call those invalid insertions. There's absolutely the possibility for a galactic cosmic ray proton to do some more different damage. And if the proton itself hits a piece of DNA, the piece of DNA is just going to be broken to bits.
Sure.
But when you get down to the gamma ray or the X ray cascade, the secondary productions, even the muons or electrons, those can do something called an invalid insertion, and it's almost a misnomer because whether or not it is a change in DNA to the benefit or the detriment, it is called an invalid insertion. Perhaps there should be a different classification if it's something good, something that helps you survive.
Sure.
Really
Well,
fascinating topic.
it's an accidental insertion, I guess. But
Accidental insertion, yes.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know that there's been any. I don't think there's been any grand plan that has necessarily led to humans or not humans. It just changes things. But I mean, we find we find at extinctions, especially at the dinosaur extinction, but we find all sorts of coal and carbon deposits that, and coal has a lot of radioactivity to it. But you will find, I went to visit the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Drumheller, Alberta. It's the largest dinosaur museum in the world. And when you look around there, you'll see in the hills and in the hoodoos that are there, but you'll see a layer of black about 1 foot thick, and that is a layer of that black carbon that was laid down at the dinosaur extinction. Underneath that layer of black carbon, that's where they find all of the dinosaur bones and remains. Above that layer of black carbon, nothing. The dinosaurs are gone, and I think that, and they found dinosaur fossils in even in Texas, where they're buried under a layer of black carbon. And again, I think that radioactivity killed some of them, but succeeded, killed all of them, but also succeeded in giving us brand new species.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it's definitely lucky that every time there's a magnetic excursion, we don't get a new coal seam on the planet. Otherwise, we might not be having this conversation, huh? That would have been probably one of the most titanic magnetic reversals. That must have lasted for a while. And that must have also included some kind of supernova nearby or something in terms of the cosmic rays to light it up like that. Or maybe there was an asteroid involved in that one, too. It's
I
interesting to
don't know.
think about.
Every time scientists can't explain something, they say it was an asteroid.
Yeah, and
I question if we've had so many of those. 12,000 years ago at the mammoth extinction, they discover that there's a layer of carbon. It's certainly not as thick as the carbon that covered the dinosaurs, but there were diamonds, microscopic diamonds that were spread across our planet 12,000 years ago. There's in Arizona, in some areas, there's a blanket of carbon that covers some of the mammoth remains. Now, there have been studies that try to blame that on an asteroid. I don't go there. I go to the magnetic reversal. And then also 12,000 years ago is when the Carolina Bays formed. And most people have never heard of the Carolina Bays. I haven't either, but Carolina Bays are depressions in the ground that studies have shown did in fact form about 12,000 years ago. And some of these depressions, they range from 20 feet deep to 50 feet deep, so they're not very deep. And they'll range up to 6 miles long by like 3 miles wide, so they're all elliptical. I went to visit one of them in South Carolina last year. It's a swamp. That's all it is now. But scientists they estimate that there are 2 million of these Carolina Bays in the United States. They call them Carolina Bays mainly because that's the kind of tree that seems to grow there, a Carolina Bay tree. But I think those, and I'm alone on this one so far, we'll see what happens, but I think those Carolina Bays were formed by gigantic explosions in the sky during the magnetic reversal.
Interesting. What kind of
You can
explosion?
actually go onto Google if somebody wants to. You can actually go onto Google Earth, and you can see these things. They're huge. I mean, these bays, these Carolina bays, are bigger than entire cities. So I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be in one of those areas during the reversal.
Wow. Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. I'll admit when you describe them and if my head's going into magnetic reversal, the first thing that my imagination thinks is large chunks of rock, crystal, metal underground getting shifted by magnetic fields or something like that during the reversal. But boy, that is an imagination inspiring concept. The Carolina Bays. We'll have to look into that one a little more. Robert, I have a question. What besides recommending that everyone keep their eyes open, remain somewhat suspicious of things that everybody seems to accept as true, and of course checking out the updates you do on the upcoming ice age on your website daily or nearly daily. Um, you have anything that maybe you're looking for, like a canary in the coal mine, something that if you saw it, you would really start to be concerned. So, for example, for us, because of who we are, we the first thing we wanted to think about seeing was worsening cosmic rays. You know, is this actually? It's one thing to hear that the magnetic field is weakening and that the magnetic poles are moving, but are we actually seeing the increase? And there was a paper that was released just on February 22nd, and I consider it one of our canaries in the coal mine. It was one of the best cosmic ray forecasts as we entered sunspot minimum, and their conclusion was that the cosmic ray situation is worsening faster than they were predicting it to have worsened, faster than they would estimate, just based on the lack of sunspots and the lack of stuff like that. But we're sort of science geeks. We're data hogs. We look at stuff like that. Is there anything canary in the coal mine wise that maybe you're looking for or that you're starting to see already?
One of the things I look for is an increase in volcanic activity, because certainly during previous little ice ages there have been some major volcanic eruptions that did cool the planet. So that's one of the things. I do look for more extreme weather, and that could be either droughts or that could be more snow. And of course, my ice age is called icegenow.info. So certainly, I'm looking for evidence of an ice age. The other thing I look for is sea levels to stop rising. Uh, I keep hearing all this fear about rising sea levels, but sea levels have been rising for 8,000 years. During the last ice age, sea levels were actually about 400 feet lower than they are right now. That's where all of the moisture came from to build up those giant ice sheets in the north. Well, and you don't hear about this much, but in 2000, so going back here, on average for the last 8,000 years, sea levels have been rising about the thickness of a dime and a nickel put together every single year. So this is something that's been going on for thousands of years, nothing to do with humans that I can see. However, in 2011, sea levels did not rise. In 2012, sea levels did not rise. And last year, this is according to NASA, last year sea levels did not rise. So if I start to see more and more times when sea levels did not rise, then I know automatically that we must be getting more ice somewhere that is building up and getting locked up on land.
Yes. Well, I this is something fantastic. I love how you go in and you actually find the real data because we all know how easy it is to go find a headline about some computer model that some scientist made that says we're all going to be flooded out in a couple of decades. And I don't think that's going to stop, is it?
No, that's going to. Well, there's so much money involved in the global warming belief that no, I think that's going to keep on going until we're buried in the snow. But I just look at what's been going on the East Coast this last week. I mean, they've had two nor'easters in the last week, and there's another one on the way next week. Parts of Vermont this week, parts of Vermont have had 3 feet of snow, and in a large part of Connecticut and Massachusetts, they've had 2 feet of snow in New York, and this is already well into March. So these things, of course, they help me believe that we're headed into an ice age. But again, those things, they all, I think, tie together with the reversal and with precession of the equinoxes.
Yeah. Robert, thank you very much. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again. As I mentioned before, updates all the time on exactly where we are in this process, some of the top news in this ice age march that we are going through as a planet and as a people. That's iceagenow.info. Robert, Felix, thank you once again. Really appreciate your time today.
Ben, thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed it.